jurors are present. Everyone else may be seated. Defense, whenever you're ready, you may give your closing argument.
Thank you, Your Honor. State. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before I go into my closing argument, I just want to touch on a couple things that Mr. Sachs said. For almost an hour of Mr. Sachs' opening statement, he talked about everything that Nickolas did on February 14, 2018, in detail. He walked you down the halls that you walked down, and he showed you the videos that he has shown you several times. And that day, Nickolas did exactly what he said he was going to do. And we have never said that he didn't do that. He has never said that he didn't do that. What he did has never been in dispute. This phase of the trial, of the proceedings, is not about accountability. Because when Nickolas pled on October 20th, 2021, he was found accountable. The decision that has to be made by each of you individually is how he should be punished. Nickolas knew the difference between right and wrong that day. And he chose wrong. And we know that because he pled to 17 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. Yes, he planned what he was going to do on February 14th. And he pled to that, and he accepted responsibility for that. Choosing to kill is not an aggravating factor. It is not for your consideration when you are making your decision about whether or not he should live or die. He chose to kill, and he chose to plead guilty to those charges. Mr. Sachs also spoke about the drug screens that Brenda took. And one that seems to be particularly important is the drug screen that was done from the meconium. And we call Dr. Scully, seems like forever ago, but she was the pharmacologist. That's the only thing that Dr. Scully does. And she reviewed all those records, and what did she tell us? She told us that she literally contacted the lab, went over the drug screen form, talked about the test that was actually administered, and what did the lab tell her? That it wasn't a sensitive test. The state also told you that Brenda passed every single drug test. Well, we know she passed the first drug test, which put her on notice that every time she went to the doctor, appointments that she scheduled, she would be drug tested. So what do we know? For 4 months, Brenda didn't go back to the doctor. She was off the grid. She was roaming the streets. She was selling her body. She was smoking crack. And she was drinking alcohol. And then eventually she gets placed on probation, so we know probation does some testing. We don't have any results from probation. Those records no longer exist. So we really don't know if she tested positive when she went to probation twice. Another important fact about that meconium that Mr. Sachs spoke about is that it was actually collected 22 hours after Nickolas was born. And we know from the testimony of Mrs. Scully, Dr. Scully, that if there's drugs or alcohol, it isn't necessarily evenly distributed throughout the fluid. Was she smoking crack? How long was she smoking crack? You get to make that decision. Who do you believe? But what we do know with 100% certainty is that not one of those tests that Brenda took ever tested for alcohol. Mr. Satz spoke to you about the DCF call, and I will touch on it in my statement, but there's a couple things I'd like to point out. And I, like Mr. Satz, encourage you to read every single document, everything that is in evidence, which means all of this, if you so choose. And if there's a particular document, excuse me, that an attorney referenced, or a witness referenced, or a doctor believed was important in forming their opinion, you can ask us for that. And we can pull it for you. But they're here. This is Nickolas's life. If you want to read anything. And I encourage you, and I'll point out a couple things, just like Mr. Satz did with the DCF report. To give you some context for this DCF report, and there's bait stamps on the pages, so if there's something particular you'd like to look at, this is a DCF 1 of 22. It's the same thing that Mr. Satz showed you. But what I'd like to point out is why this call happened in the first place. And we talked about it, and you heard some testimony. Excuse me. That there was some issues that Nickolas was having at school, and that several people had evaluated him for a Baker Act. 4 people, in fact, and one of them refused, which was the school resource officer, Scott Peterson. But what do we also know? That school social worker, who licensed by the state of Florida, was able to Baker Act someone. She had the license to do it. But the school district has a law or a rule or a policy that actually says the school social workers are not allowed to Baker Act the students. So the actual licensed professionals at a school, they're not allowed to do it. But she encouraged the school resource officer to. And then she called Henderson, that came out to MSD, an intern, being supervised. And that didn't happen, right? So that school social worker called the Department of Children and Family. They have an abuse hotline. Because she wanted something done. Nothing was being done. This kid wanted to buy a gun. There was allegations that he was cutting. There was allegations that he was drinking alcohol. His mother was not concerned that he wanted to buy a gun. So she called the Department of Children and Family, and at this time, Nickolas was 18 years old. So the designation that Nickolas got as being a mentally ill, vulnerable adult, that was given to him by the Department of Children and Family. That's a designation based on a call. The purpose of the call, and it's all here, and it talks about some of the things that I just said to you about the school, was to do a risk level assessment. Because that school social worker was concerned about what was going on in that house. So they went to the house, and they talked to Linda Cruz, and they talked to Nickolas Cruz, and the Department of Children and Family found, and it's in here, in their risk level assessment, no implications for his safety. He resides with his mother, and he's receiving in-home services. So the designation of him being a vulnerable, mentally ill adult did not go away. Please read this report. They just said that the current situation that he was in, he wasn't at risk. 3 days later. 3 days later, Nickolas Cruz did exactly what that school social worker was so terrified about. What she told everybody frightened her. He bought his first gun, a rifle. Literally days after being designated a vulnerably mentally ill adult by the Department of Children and Family. You know, it's funny, and it's kind of ironic in this case, specifically with Linda, and the impressions that she liked to give people, the facade that she liked to present. But living in a 4,500 square foot house in Parkland, this house, and this is already in evidence, doesn't mean that you have a good life. It doesn't mean that when you open the door and you walk in, that everything is okay. And we know that, right? Because we have all of these records, including Camelot Community Care. And that counselor, Amanda Brown, you know how she described this beautiful 45 square foot house? When she opened the door and she looked in, she described it as a war zone. A war zone. And we know from the testimony of lots and lots of records and some of the Henderson providers, and these are in evidence, this is the inside of that 45,000 square foot house. And you have these pictures, so when you get closer, you'll see that Linda has patched all the holes in the house that Zachary and Nickolas punched. Not a lot of furniture, right? Kids destroyed all that. When you get this photo, you can look closer that they had Berber carpet. And the records tell you that both Zach and Nickolas unwound the carpet, so she just left concrete. We know that Steve Sinkoff in his record said that I had to take her to Faith Farm to try and get her some furniture. Broken glass doors. And this one is particularly interesting. This is the photograph of Nickolas's and Zachary's bathroom. And when you get this photo, and you're able to see it up close, you'll see that right across from the toilet are patched marks, right? And you will know, if you review the Henderson records in episode 2, that this was one of the things that his therapist, Jared Benenfield, tried to work out with Nickolas, because he would get so frustrated, he would sit on the toilet with a knife and just strike through the drywall. This is in a 4,500 square foot house where everything was happy. We know that. The evidence tells us that. Please do not be misled by square footage and geographical locations of a home. I want to tell you that I'm going to be up here a while. And I'm sure that every single one of you understands the tremendous responsibility that not only the state has, but that myself and the other members of the defense team have. So if you need to stop to go to the bathroom, or if you're just tired of hearing my voice, and you wouldn't be the first one, just tell the judge. Because I don't want you to sit here if you have to use the restroom or if you need to get up and stretch. Because the things that I want to tell you are really, really important. And I know that each one of you wants to be present, not only physically, but mentally. So please do not hesitate to put your hand up and say, Melissa, enough. And I don't have my whole opening memorized. It's something I have always envied of Mr. Sass. So bear with me. There is no time in our life when we are more vulnerable to the will and the whim of another human being than when we are growing and developing in the womb of our mothers. Never, no other time. Now, one would think that it would be difficult for me or the other members of our team to present mitigation, to come up here and ask you to sentence Nickolas to life without the possibility of parole. But it's not, because it is the right thing to do. You would think that it would be hard after you hear we've all heard the evidence. We had to watch that video again. Some horrible pictures. Nickolas's horrible social media posts. Horrible things that he draws in the jail. But sentencing Nickolas to life and being up here and asking you to do that is the right thing to do. Ask yourself this. Did you really need to see that 14-minute video again? You've seen it in its entirety, and you've seen sections of it, and you have walked the halls of that horrible place. The horrible place that Nickolas decided to murder 17 innocent people. And remember, he would have murdered more if he could have. But you don't need to look at those photos. You don't need to hear those gunshots again. You don't need to see that 14-minute video. Everything is embedded in your brain, unfortunately, and will be for a very long time. What Nickolas Cruz did should make you angry. It should make you sad. It's devastating what he has done, not only to the people that are gone, but to these families that will never, ever recover from this. And there is nothing wrong with feeling those feelings. That's what makes us human. And you may remember that you jurors, some of you, were not the only people that were crying when those devastated parents and their siblings had to get up here and tell us about their children, their brothers and their sisters and their husband, parents that lost their babies. But by showing you those pictures, the video again, repeatedly playing the sound of the gunshots, the state of Florida wants to put you in a place of hate and anger and vengeance. Because if that is where you're at, you are more likely to sentence that young man to death. And the law that we all live by tells jurors that we must not make decisions based on passion, emotion, or anger. Why? How many times have you made a decision based solely on anger and you later regretted it? How many times in a moment of anger or rage have you said or done something that you later regret? Why do we teach people to calm down, to cool down? Take a break, take a pause, take a breath. We do that because when we make decisions based solely on emotions, the rational part of our brain is turned off and we make wrong decisions. In haste, we make decisions without opening our heart and our minds. And in a death penalty sentencing proceeding, you have to use your heart because you're making an individualized moral decision. The individual moral decision that you will be making about whether Nickolas should live or die is not a decision that should be made in an emotional state. And the judge will tell you that the decision that you have to make here today, or however long it takes you, because we will all be here, please don't ever feel pressured to reach a verdict. Take your time. And the judge will tell you that you must carefully consider and weigh the evidence, realizing, and this is in the jury instructions, that you literally have another human being's life at stake. Please take your time. The decision that you make here today, or when you do, is a decision that you can never take back, ever. The law and your conscience requires you to look beyond the pain which seeks vengeance, not justice. Your struggle to raise yourself above revenge and sympathy will be difficult because you're human beings and you have heard horrible things. But it's a struggle that you knowingly undertook. We told you this wouldn't be easy. You knew this wouldn't be easy. It shouldn't be easy. But it's the oath that you took, and it's the promise that you made. And we know that each and every one of you will keep your oath and honor your promise. We are here because every single one of you during jury selection said that you believed life without the possibility of parole could be an appropriate sentence for someone that kills 17 people. If you weren't open to that, you would not be here. Our criminal justice system literally relies and depends on the independence and courage of jurors. The history of our legal system is filled with jurors that have made unpopular decisions. But those jurors performed their duty and demonstrated courage and bravery and independence. One vote for life means the death penalty will not be imposed. Your individual moral decision must not be based upon what you think that this community wants or what you think anybody else wants. This is your individual moral decision. No one else's. And when you wake up in the middle of the night and you don't have your fellow jurors, and you wonder, did I make the right decision? Did I do the right thing? There will only be your heart, your moral compass, and what lies deep within your soul and who you are. There will be no one else there but yourself and your decision. You must choose courage over comfort. You must be willing to do what is uncomfortable. You must be brave enough to follow your heart. Because if you do, you will know that life is the appropriate verdict in this case, not just based on the crime that was committed, but based on the person, the human being that committed it. Because that's what makes this proceeding different than any other proceeding in our criminal justice system. It's the only time that a jury makes a decision about whether or not another human being lives or dies. So you need to know, and that's what we have tried to do, is show you who Nickolas Cruz is, not just what he did. But whatever your individual moral decision is, whatever your compass, your heart, your soul tells you to do, you must respect your fellow jurors and their decision. And I have no doubt that you will, because you all said that you would when we talked to you in jury selection. And if you wouldn't be here. Even if you disagree, you have to respect their decision. Not only does the state of Florida want you to make a decision based on anger and revenge and hate, they have done everything they can to dehumanize Nickolas Jacob Cruz. They don't even call him by his name. What they have done is slapped on a label that says that he only has a personality disorder. And we told you in our opening statement that we don't disagree with that. Check, check, check. But that doesn't describe all of Nickolas's behavior. But if you just slap a label on somebody that has a personality disorder, they're antisocial, their character, their person is flawed, it's a whole lot easier to kill them because you don't see them as a human being. You're just reducing Nickolas to his worst act. It's easier to call somebody antisocial or borderline personality disorders than to accept what Nickolas Cruz really is. A broken, brain-damaged, mentally ill young man. And if we say that Nickolas is only antisocial or borderline personality disorder, then it's a Nickolas Cruz problem. But if we recognize what he really is, that damaged, brain-damaged, broken, mentally ill person, it becomes a human issue. And every human life has value. We are not saying that Nickolas doesn't have a personality disorder. We never have. What we are saying is that he also has FASD. He has both. And that is what the evidence has supported. You are about to make one of the most important decisions that you may ever make in your entire life. And you will never be able to change that decision. You will never be able to change your mind. And you will have to live with your decision. for the rest of your life. And you are never, ever required to vote for death. You can base your decision, your vote for life, on anything, just like Mr. Satt said. And you don't have to explain it, you don't have to justify it, and you don't have to defend it, because it's your individual moral decision. And at some point, we have to realize that brain damaged and mentally ill people are not going anywhere. And that we cannot ignore them or disregard them. At some point, we have to realize that there are women who will continue to abuse alcohol, do drugs, live a risky lifestyle while they are pregnant, do not get proper prenatal care, and that they damage their babies that are growing in their belly. And they damage the brain of the baby that is growing in their belly. There will be more Nickolas Cruzes, because there will be more women that drink alcohol when they're pregnant, that poison their baby. But like Dr. Jones told us, we must remove the stigma that is associated with this disorder. We must get those kids the proper diagnosis, the number one thing he said that they need. And we must give those kids the services that they deserve, for them and for all of us. But sentencing Nickolas to death, extinguishing his life, will not make those problems go away. Sentencing Nickolas to death will change absolutely nothing. It will not bring back those 17 innocent victims that he viciously murdered. It won't. You now know that Nickolas is a brain-damaged, broken, mentally ill person through no fault of his own. He was literally poisoned in Brenda's womb. This woman. These pictures and evidence. She poisoned him in her womb. He was doomed from the womb. And in a civilized, humane society, do we kill brain-damaged, mentally ill, broken people? Do we? I hope not. But that does not mean that because you're brain damaged and you're mentally ill and you're broken, that you don't deserve to be punished. He deserves to be punished. And no one at this table would ever disagree with you. But what the law says is that you are to take into consideration their damage when you sentence them. We are not asking you to let Nickolas Cruz walk out of this courtroom. That is not what we're asking you to do. We are asking you to punish him, and to punish him severely. We are asking you to sentence him to prison for the rest of his life, where he will wait to die, either by natural causes or whatever else could possibly happen to him while he's in prison. He will never get out. Never. He will never walk a free step again. The law of our country says that the death penalty is reserved for the worst of the worst crimes committed by the worst of the worst offenders. The worst of the worst offenders are never people that are mentally ill and brain damaged. through no fault of their own. They're just not. What did Nickolas not have control over? He did not have control over who his biological mother was. He had no control over how he was conceived. He had no control over how much Colt 45 that Brenda drank when he was growing in her belly. He had no control over how much Cisco, and we now know because of Dr. Scully, that one bottle is the equivalent of 5 shots of vodka while he was growing in her belly. He had no control over Brenda being arrested for possession of cocaine when he was growing in her belly. He had no control over the chaotic environment that she was living in for most of her pregnancy, on the streets, having sex for money and drugs, where her number one priority was not prenatal care, but it was her addiction. Nickolas had no control over the crack that Brenda smoked while he was growing in her belly. And he had no control over the amount of cigarettes that she smoked when he was in her belly. Is that factor in and of itself, as Mr. Sapp said, a reason for life? No. But if you take it all in its totality, it talks and shows you about a woman who was not taking care of the baby that was growing in her belly. We cannot allow ourselves to be disconnected from the most vulnerable people in our society, the broken and brain damaged, the mentally ill. How we treat those people says more about who we are as a society, more about who you are as a human being, than anything else. What is Nickolas's fault? What he pled to. And just like I told you in the very beginning, when I stood up, we're not here to decide guilt and innocence. That's done. And for today, for 1,700 days, we, the defense, have held Nickolas Cruz's life in our hands. And we have done everything that we could possibly do to uncover and to examine and to tell you Nickolas's life story and the lives of those that shaped his. We did that, just like I told you in my opening, so that you would have reasons to vote for life. And while we, the defense, were literally spending every waking moment examining every aspect of Nickolas's life and the lives of the people that shaped him, the state of Florida was spending the same amount of time trying to do everything that they could to show you and to prove to you that executing Nickolas is the only way that justice can be served in this case. And they could not be more wrong. To take a life when a life has been lost is revenge, not justice. That's what Desmond Tutu told us. We can have sadness, heartbreak, without hate. We can have fear, because fear and anger makes us vindictive. It makes us unjust. It makes us unfair. And vengeance has no place in a civilized society. Punishment without understanding is not justice. We can give mercy to the very people that deserve it the least. Mercy is not earned. It's not deserved. It is something that is bestowed upon someone. And you give it because it's the right thing to do. Mercy is what makes us civilized. Mercy is what puts an end to violence. Giving mercy to Nickolas will say more about who you are than it will ever say about him. Holding the weight of another person's life in your hand is a tremendous responsibility. I know that. We know that. And upon conclusion of my closing argument, I will pass you that weight. The weight of Nickolas Cruz's life. For the time has now come where you must make a decision, your own individual moral decision about whether Nickolas Cruz should live or die. And you are never, and I say it so many times, I cannot say it enough, you are never required to vote for death. And to make that decision, you must get close. You have to look into the soul of another person, look at their entire life, not just what they did, but who they are in order to make that decision. And that's what each of you promised that you would do. Every one of you said that you could look past Nickolas's crime and punish the person, not the crime. You said that you wanted to and that you needed to know everything. Not just parts of things, not just clips of things, not just a page of a document, but everything in order to make that decision. What we now have that we never had before, what Dr. Jones says that kids like Nickolas so desperately need, is a diagnosis, a proper diagnosis. You now know that Nickolas is mentally ill and has neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. And how do you know that? Because we showed you that. We brought the best experts in the country to tell you that based on their evaluations. The beginning often holds the clue to everything that happens. We brought you people in here from his entire life, people that actually knew him, that saw him, that interacted with him, that treated him, that taught him, that medicated him, that counseled him, that loved him. Not just people that were evaluating him when he was facing the death penalty. You have heard records, and you have heard testimony, and you have seen records, because we have moved everything in. Because you have a tremendous responsibility. You hold another human being's life in your hands. And we wanted you to have everything, just not parts of it. And let's talk about some of the testimony you heard from defense witnesses. Carolyn Deakins. Well, she certainly, and thankfully, is not the woman that she was in 1998, when she was arrested with Brenda on June 6th. Today, she is a woman who is grateful to be alive because she probably shouldn't be. And in 2020, Carolyn Deakin was living her life in Kentucky, clean and sober, with her children and her grandchildren. She was working, she was helping other addicts, she was paying it back, until one day, Miss O'Shea and I knocked on her door. And we asked her to relive the most traumatic and painful part of her life. A part that most of her family didn't even know about. Most of her friends didn't know about, but she had never even heard Nickolas Cruz's name before, and she certainly hadn't heard Brenda Woodard's in 22 years. But she never hesitated. Not for 1 second. You get to determine and weigh the credibility of witnesses. And the judge will tell you that one way that you can do that, to determine if you believe what people are saying to you, is whether the evidence is supported by other evidence or by other testimony. Carolyn Deacon is a woman who, for the first time in 24 years, after vowing never to step foot in Broward County again, because it was too painful, there were too many memories, came in here and testified not only before you, but the entire world about how she was a crack-addicted prostitute. Who sold her body to get high. You decide whether or not you believe the things that Carolyn Deacon's told you. And whether or not she's resentful towards Brenda Woodard. Do you know why she came in here and testified? Because everything she said is the truth. And because it was the right thing to do. And in my opening statement, I told you what I believed the evidence would show you. But now we know what the evidence showed you. That Carolyn and Brenda were homeless, drug-addicted alcoholics who walked the streets of US 1. And although, and Carolyn did tell us this, she told us what they smoked, how much they smoked, what they drank, how much they drank. They filled up those big gulp cups. All the prostitutes did. Remember her telling us that? And although they may not have hung out every day from March until the date of their arrest, we know from Carolyn's testimony that they had the same job and that they worked the same streets. And Miss Deacon actually told you that she would see Brenda on the streets and they would go behind a building and they would do a hit of crack and they would slam a couple beers and then they would go back to work. And as we get closer to the time of that arrest, they were together every single day. And how do we know that? Because the Cruzes were paying for the efficiency that Brenda was living in on that dirty mattress they had pulled inside. Carolyn told you all of the things that they were doing, both knowing that inside Brenda Woodard's belly was that baby. But you see, by that time, Brenda's addiction was so out of control that the drugs and the alcohol were more important to her than the baby that was growing inside of her. And on June 6, 1998, after she had gotten off of work and Brenda had just boosted some steaks, they stopped and got a 12-pack of beer, and they went to the drug dealer and got 5 crack rocks. And Carolyn told you what they were going to do that night. They were fixing to get good and high. And we all know what actually happened. You saw the police report. Dr. Scott was very clear to point out that Brenda had a 0% alcohol. And this isn't evidence, so I don't expect you to strain. But you know what else is interesting on this booking sheet? That 6 months pregnant, Brenda weighed 145 pounds. And when you go back to those adoption records in March, and you look at how much she weighed then, she weighed 140 pounds. What else is interesting that wasn't mentioned when Dr. Scott testified is that the police officer in his report said that he saw Brenda pass the drug dealer the money. And the drug dealer passed Brenda the crack. What else did Dr. Scott not tell us until he was cross-examined by Mrs. Curtis? That there was beer in the car. So they weren't drinking yet. Dr. Scott and the state of Florida actually wants you to believe that these two women who had just purchased 5 crack rocks and a 12-pack of beer were not getting ready to party. And another thing that Dr. Scott didn't tell you on direct examination, because it would be inconsistent with his concern about the amount of alcohol that Brenda drank. 5.5 weeks, maybe 3 beers. But on cross-examination, Mrs. Curtis, showed him adoption record, page 640, that in July, when the social worker was doing the adoption report, she states that she did drink beer during the first 3 months of her pregnancy. Brenda smokes 1 pack of cigarettes daily. You get to decide and evaluate the credibility of all of the witnesses. Not just by what they told you, but about what they didn't tell you. I also want you to know something. We've all been here for a really long time. I don't remember what every single witness said. I'm sure not anybody else does. And I'm probably going to get in a lot of trouble for this. But Miss Bailey has been here the entire time, and she has typed down every single word that every witness has said during this entire trial. So if you have a question about the testimony that you heard or the words that came out of a witness's mouth, you can send a note and you can say, I would like a readback of the testimony of this witness or that witness. This decision is too important for you to guess or rely on your memory. However, I have noticed that we have some very diligent note takers. But I just want you to know that that is available for you. And when we talk about Daniel Woodard, Daniel Woodard didn't even know that Nickolas Cruz was her brother when Miss O'Shea went to the prison that she was at 3 years ago. But that very first visit, she said, I will do whatever I can do. Not because 3 years later, the brother that she just found out that she had, Zachary, was paying for her lawyer. You decide if she's credible. But what does Danielle help us understand about the choices that Brenda made when Nickolas was growing inside her belly? Her level of detail and memory is very impressive, in my opinion. She remembers that it was the summer before her 6th grade and that she was 11 years old. And she remembers Brenda picking her up. They drove to a gas station right across the street from a women's shelter right here in Broward called Women in Distress. And she remembers how Brenda got out of the car, went inside, came back out with a bottle of Cisco in a brown paper bag and a cigarette in her mouth. And as she started pumping gas, Danielle was sitting in the car, and she turns around and she notices that there's broken glass all over the floor and that the window had been busted out. And the next thing she notices is that it looks like Brenda has a baby bump. So she asks Brenda, "Are you pregnant?" "I was raped," Brenda says. So I went and I looked back at those adoption records. And I found, and it's on page 73 of the adoption records, that on August 25th of 1998, there was a job work order where Brenda got that busted window fixed. So it's amazing the memory that Danielle has. That's what trauma does. It makes some things impossible to remember or forget. And Danielle then told you that that's when she started living with her mother, and it was during that time that Nickolas was developing in Brenda's polluted womb. Those were Danielle's words. Danielle told you about more of the choices that Brenda made when she was pregnant with Nickolas. She remembers calling her grandmother and saying to her grandmother, "Things are so out of control, you have got to come up here." And her grandmother did. But in the interim, Miss Curtis asked Danielle, what did out of control look like? This is an 11-year-old child. I saw Brenda, because remember she doesn't call her mom, smoking crack and cigarettes. I saw her drinking Cisco alcohol. I saw her prostituting. I saw Brenda taking money from other addicts so that they had a place to get high. She was like the rent lady. Danielle eventually ran away from Brenda, and she ended up in foster care, and eventually she got involved in the criminal justice system. And you know that because despite how embarrassing it must have been for her to come in here in a jail uniform and shackles, she did it because it's the truth and it was the right thing to do. And the state wants you to question when Danielle was actually with her mother. But the records tell you exactly when she was. I showed you the work form, so we know August. But we also have that same adoption report that was written in July, and it's in evidence, that the social worker did this evaluation, and she said, Brenda discussed that she has a daughter, Danielle, age 11, who has resided most of her life with Brenda's mother. But Danielle was present during the interview. So we now know that Danielle was with her mother in July and August. So when you are weighing her credibility, please take those things into consideration. Danielle also remembers the little roses that were painted on the crack pipes that her mom would send her to the store to get, and how she would play on the railroad tracks on Las Olas. Danielle believed with all of her heart that Nickolas was going to get all the things she didn't get. She even asked to go live with Linda. But her brother, Nickolas Cruz, never recovered from the drugs and the alcohol that Brenda put in her polluted womb. You heard a lot about Nickolas's early life. And we know how happy Linda and Roger were to have a baby. It's something that Linda had always wanted. And we know that from Trish and Finney, that from very early on, Nickolas was not like other children. He was delayed socially. emotionally, verbally, cognitively, physically. He struggled in virtually every area. And we know that Trish and Finney had already raised some children. And the tantrums that Nickolas had were so intense and continued when most children stopped having them. And he wet his bed long after most children stopped wetting their bed. And that he had obsessions from the very early age with food, and he had unusual fears. He couldn't be away from Linda. This is when he's 2 years old. And Steven Sh00ter, I don't think anybody can forget him. This is a man who lived across the street from the Cruzes from 2009 to 2015. From the time that Nickolas was 10 to 15 years old. And he told you that from the moment he set his eyes on Nickolas, he could tell that there was something not right with him. And he was introduced by the neighbor to Nickolas, and she said, "He's the weird one. He looked strange, he acted strange, he didn't make eye contact, he didn't speak much. He was the outcast of the neighborhood." And both Trish and Steven told you the other kids didn't want to play with him. And Steven Sh00ter told you that he was working on his motorcycle in his driveway, and he heard loud screaming noise. And he looked outside of Linda's house, who was pulling out of her driveway in her minivan. And a 15-year-old Nickolas Cruz came running out of the house like he was 3. "Mommy, Mommy, you didn't kiss me before you left." Why did Trish and Finney come in here and testify? Because what they said is the truth. And it was the right thing to do. And you also heard testimony from Paul Gold. And I promise you I'm not going to go through every witness. Who lived next door to the Cruz house with Roxanne and Rocky. We now know who those people are. And he told you about Nickolas's strange behavior. Same thing that Trish had observed, same thing that Finney had observed, same thing that Steven Sh00ter had observed. And he tried to help Nickolas out, and Zachary, because by then, Nickolas had witnessed the death of his father when he was sitting on his father's lap. So he knew that they didn't have a positive male role model. But he remembers that Nickolas would do things like attack his trailer with a golf club for no reason. He told you that it just looked like Nickolas couldn't control himself. And after Nickolas would do something like that, he would be so remorseful and so ashamed. And Paul told you, because he has his own children, that it looked like Nickolas had some developmental delays, problems socializing with other kids. He told you how immature Nickolas was compared to the other children. Far more immature than his brother, who was 18 months younger than him. And he told you that Nickolas had very obsessive tendencies. At that point, it was penguins. And he told you that he actually saw, just like Finney did, and just like Steve Sh00ter did, and just like Trish did, they actually saw Zachary bullying Nickolas, along with the other kids in the neighborhood. He also told you that the reason why Nickolas killed toads in the neighborhood, the big, huge poisonous toads, is because those toads killed his dog. I'm not saying it's right, but there's an explanation. And what did Paul tell you about Linda's drinking? We've never called her an alcoholic, but he did tell you that as time went on, she started drinking more. in that house that's been described as a war zone. Why did he come in here and tell you that? Because it's the truth, and because it's the right thing to do. And what did Steven Sh00ter also tell us? And I can't believe I almost forgot to say this. But he said that boy didn't go bad. He was never right. The state of Florida tried to discredit Paul Gold, saying that he was trying to benefit from the murder of 17 people, trying to convince Nickolas to do something to make some money, but that's not true. What Paul did tell you is that after Nickolas did what he did, he started donating money to organizations, $17,000 at a time. And one organization that he picked was an organization to help young girls and women that were being sex trafficked. But what did you hear? You heard clips of a phone call. Not the whole phone call. Clips of the phone call. Wouldn't you have liked to have heard all of that conversation? To put it in context? We know Trish and Linda went back and forth about the help that she said Nickolas needed. But we know eventually, upon Roger's insistence, they took Nickolas to his first psychiatrist when he was 3.5 years old, Dr. Musil. And his records are here. And you can tell in his psychiatric evaluation that in that evaluation, there's a notation that says birth mother, drugs, and alcohol. So even then, it was on somebody's radar. And he gave recommendations to Linda. He told Linda to come back, but Linda never went back. But there came a time when somebody else got involved, that got the ball rolling, and that was Ann Fisher. That was the woman that testified from Early Minds Learning Center. And she said that she knew right away that there was something not right with Nickolas, and that he needed to be somewhere else, that he needed more support, and that he needed more services. And this was a conversation that we know from the evidence that many people had throughout his life. And she contacted ChildNet and got the ball rolling for Nickolas to get involved in services. And you can rely on your own memory about the things that Ann Fisher told you about Nickolas as a child. He was removed from that preschool. Well, actually, he got kicked out, remember? And he began his special education. And he had an IEP, an individual education plan, at the earliest age possible for a child to have one, 3.5. Until 2016, when this brain-damaged, mentally ill, broken child, who 5 weeks before had been designated a vulnerable, mentally ill adult by the Department of Children and Family, revoked his ESC services. Now you have to remember that his mother, Linda, had been very involved, just like Mr. Sack said, in all of Nickolas's services. She wasn't even invited to the meeting. So Nickolas made that decision. And in the school records, SR 1618, and you'll pull it, is a typed note, not with Marjorie Stoneman Douglas letterhead, not the document that's supposed to be filled out from the Department of Education when someone revokes their ESC services, but a typewritten note. And to this day, we have no idea who typed it. And Nickolas's notes, his name, he scribbled. When Nickolas got rid of his services, he didn't stop needing them. He didn't stop being brain damaged or learning impaired. He didn't stop having a receptive and expressive language disorder. He didn't stop having a mental illness. But all of those services stopped. And one other very important thing also stopped, his medication. And we know from the testimony that you heard and the records that you have seen and that you can see that Nickolas has consistently struggled academically through his entire life. His entire life. And there is not one single teacher or educational provider that the state of Florida could have brought in here to tell you anything different. Not one. And on May 10th, 2004, before Nickolas was designated to go into the cluster at Coral Springs Elementary, he had an evaluation by a school psychologist. And you can read that evaluation. But what I want to tell you that's probably the most important thing that Dr. Hoppe did in that evaluation is she recommended that this 5-year-old child get a psychiatric evaluation so that he could be properly diagnosed, they could properly determine the services that he needed in school, the interventions that he needed in school, what instructional programs, services, and accommodations would help Nickolas. Dr. Hoppe was doing her job. But you know what? The Broward School District was not. Because this specific psychiatric evaluation that this school psychologist recommended, that she believed that Nickolas Cruz needed, never happened. And we know that he saw Dr. Karp, that he saw Dr. Negan. They're psychiatrists, but they were not providing the psychiatric evaluation that Dr. Hoppe recommended. So you have to wonder if things would have been different for Nickolas if he had started getting the services that everyone knew that he needed when he was in elementary school. Because you know what school offers those types of services for a child that's in kindergarten? Cross Creek. But he didn't get those services then. Because he never got that psychiatric evaluation. Let's talk a little bit about that upward trajectory that Dr. Scott referred to. That he wants you to believe is proof that Nickolas does not have FASD. That he just has a personality disorder. Dr. Scott told you about Nickolas's experience at Coral Springs Elementary. And he agreed, I think everybody agrees, that the best environment for Nickolas was a highly structured one with specialized instruction, specialized trained teachers, one-on-one. Probably why he did so well when he was with his psychologists for treatment, or Dr. Scott and Dr. Denny, because he was getting that type of interaction. And he ends up in the cluster. And Dr. Scott tells you that in kindergarten he was retained. They could have promoted him, but they didn't because mom and the school wanted him to mature. And then he continued to talk about how well Nickolas did at Coral Springs. But what he didn't tell you until he was questioned by Miss Curtis was that Nickolas received a good cause promotion from 1st to 2nd grade. And that good cause promotion does not mean that he was doing good. It means that he could not be retained because he was a special needs student and it would be illegal for them to do it again. What else did Dr. Scott not tell you? He did not tell you that Nickolas did not meet the criteria for promotion from 3rd to 4th grade, but they promoted him because he got a 2 out of a 5 on the FCATs. He didn't tell you that. And he also didn't tell you that from 4th to 5th grade, Nickolas received another good cause promotion. So let's talk about that academic trajectory that he says Nickolas was on. Why didn't he tell you those things? Because being retained or receiving a good cause promotion doesn't support his theory that Nickolas was on an upwards trajectory and that he didn't continue to have academic struggles like children with FASD do. And we know on cross-examination when Ms. Curtis actually showed him that standardized testing that he said Nickolas did so well on, that he had to admit that those scores indicated that Nickolas had either little success or limited success. He wasn't progressing academically. And I just want to remind you of a few things that John Newnham and Lynn Rodriguez told you. They told you that Linda lacked the foundation of parenting, that she didn't utilize the services that they gave her, that she was overwhelmed and had a lack of support. And they told you that the entire time that Nickolas was at Coral Springs Elementary, that he was anxious, that he was fearful, and that he was nervous, and that he worried a lot, and that he looked at the 4, and he wasn't responsive to communication, and that he would apologize over and over again, even when he didn't need to. And they told you that Nickolas had obsessive compulsive tendencies like clock watching, consistently worrying about missing the bus, a bus that he never missed. He was worried his mother wouldn't pick him up. He asked the same questions over and over and over again, and he was skin picking. But Dr. Scott, who says he read all of the same records, didn't tell you that. Because if he did, then he also wouldn't be able to say that Nickolas was just anxious in 3rd grade. So he doesn't have FASD. Dr. Scott and Dr. Denny didn't even want to talk to Nickolas about the fact that he watched his father die or his mother die. And we now know that Nickolas was sexually abused, but traumatic life experiences were not even included in their evaluation. Not even a consideration. But Dr. Denny on cross-examination did admit when Mr. Secor asked him that those events were traumatic and that they would have an impact on a child. Every provider at Coral Springs Elementary believed that Nickolas's bad behavior was the result of his emotional and behavioral disability. And the state of Florida could not bring in one witness that told you otherwise. And when Nickolas left Coral Springs Elementary and went to West Glades, he still had the same designation. He still had the same eligibility. But what changed? He was no longer in the cluster. He was no longer receiving special education because special instruction, that one-on-one he was getting, because they don't do that in middle school. And we also know that he continued to have that expressive and receptive language disorder that Dr. Scott and Dr. Denny told you he grew out of. How do we know that he still had that? Because we brought in Dr. Shamika Stanford. She is the leading forensic expert on speech and language pathology, and it's the only thing she does. She specializes in it. And what did she tell you? Rely on your memory about the impact that a receptive and expressive language disorder has on a child. But what she also told you, that it's a disorder that never goes away. But that's not consistent with a child that just has a personality disorder. But it is consistent with FASD. And why didn't the state of Florida bring in their own expert in speech and language pathology to tell you that Nickolas outgrew that disorder. Because there is no expert that would come in here and testify to that. You make a decision about who is more credible about whether or not Nickolas has a lifelong speech and language disorder. Let's talk about the principal from West Glades, Mr. Jack Vasey. This is a man that had dedicated his entire life to education, 35 years. He was the principal when Nick was there. He's now retired. He's a guardian ad litem, which is a program they have here in the court system. And he works with 2 kids who were prenatally exposed to alcohol. And he told you that they act very similar and have the very similar behaviors and disabilities that Nickolas does. He also told you that he taught at a behavioral center. And that's where kids go when their behavior is not a manifestation of their mental illness. That is not where Nickolas went. He went to Cross Creek, which is where children go whose behavior is a manifestation of their mental illness. And what did Mr. Vasey tell you, and also Jessica Clark, his family counselor, the entire time that he was at West Glades? They both told you that from the very beginning, and you can look at Jessica Clark's progress notes, September of his 6th grade year, September, we start school in August, that he struggled academically. He was struggling in math and language arts. And coincidentally, math is the area that children with FASD struggle with the most. And she also tells you how he doesn't understand things. He doesn't like one of his classes because they're introducing measurements, and he doesn't get it. So please read Jessica Clark's notes. This is the same time that Miss Nast made that comment about the only thing that Nickolas wanted to do was set fires, I think, and kill people. That doesn't tell his whole story. So what is important from Mr. Vasey and Jessica Clark is that the struggles that Nickolas was having started in 6th grade, not in 8th grade. The records support that. And what else did Jack Vasey tell you? That West Glades could not provide the services that Nickolas needed. They had 1,300 students and they could not do it. And that Nickolas belonged at Cross Creek. And I think all of you can remember the type of therapeutic educational environment Cross Creek is. And he said that he did not believe that Nickolas should have ever gone to MSD. Because if he couldn't handle it with 1,300 students without a therapeutic environment, then there is no way he could handle it with 3,300 students. The judge will tell you that it is perfectly fine for a lawyer to talk to a witness. She will give you that instruction. And we know from Mr. Vasey's testimony that the morning that he was supposed to come in here and testify that he received a phone call from his friend, not his lawyer, but a friend who happened to be a lawyer, Christopher Whitelock, and on that phone call was Mr. Marcus. And you heard how that phone call made Jack Vasey feel. And this is directly from his testimony. They were concerned about the testimony that I was going to give and how I might implicate other people. And then he said, "I'm glad I didn't have my blood pressure checked when it hit." I don't mean to sound sarcastic. It was a very uncomfortable phone call. And to this hour, I don't understand why that ever occurred. I feel it was enough to make me feel uncomfortable to not want to come in and testify. That was my initial reaction. It still is. You know, it's the day I'm coming in to testify, and all of a sudden I get this call. I was very uncomfortable. I don't know why that call was made. You get to make that decision. But he was brave anyways, and he came in here and he testified and he told you the truth, and he did that because that was the right thing to do. And you know who else was really brave? Carrie Yon. She was brave and she was persistent, and you know how terrified she was of Nickolas Cruz. She told you that she would drive to work and her stomach would be sick, knowing that she was going to have him in her classroom. But she didn't want him expelled. She didn't want him suspended. She wanted him to get help. She knew that Westglades was not the place that he belonged. And she went to people. And some people helped. And other people said he has every right to be here. But you know what else she did? She kept 152 pages of documents related to Nickolas Cruz for 8 years. And why did she do that? Because she was concerned that the copy she gave to the school would disappear. When we got the school records from the Broward County School District, we didn't get those records. We got those records from Carrie Yon. So it turns out that Carrie Yon was right. That records disappear. We know that eventually Nickolas got into Cross Creek. He got the services that he needed. We also know that at Cross Creek you have an individual education plan and that you work at the level that you're at academically, and that you get services throughout your entire day. And Dr. Scott referred to Dr. Klein's evaluation. This is the evaluation that got Nickolas into Cross Creek, one of them. And of this 7-page document, which I encourage you to read, he took 2 words out of this entire document. Deceives others. Because that's what supports his diagnosis. He didn't want you to look at the whole report, right? Because if you looked at the whole report, then you would know that they did some academic testing before Nickolas went to Cross Creek. And you would know that when he was 15 years old, he was reading at a grade equivalency of 4.9. A math equivalency of 5.4, and a writing level of 3.3. So let's talk about that upward academic trajectory he was telling you about. It doesn't exist. And if you look at the records, that supports that. And you can also read the psychosocial evaluation that was done by Ms. Posey. She testified. And she told you that Linda was desperate to get the right diagnosis, that it was not just ADHD. She was screaming for help. And just like Mr. Satz said, she had been doing it for years. That's the level of frustration that Dr. Jones was telling you about when parents are up against the things that they have to face before they know that they have a child with FASD, and the importance of a proper diagnosis. And the state could not bring in one academic provider throughout his whole academic career to tell you that he didn't continue to struggle. Not one. And we know socially from the testimony that we heard, the records that we reviewed, that he continued to struggle with that issue and through his entire life, and he still does. And the state of Florida could not bring in one witness that actually knew Nickolas, that grew up with Nickolas, that taught Nickolas, that provided him with services, to come in here and tell you that he was not socially impaired. A language disorder is a hallmark of FASD. It's not a personality disorder. And that's why Dr. Scott and Dr. Denny wanted you to disregard it, so you wouldn't consider FASD. And we know that Nickolas suffered from severe anxiety his entire life. But Dr. Scott and Dr. Denny didn't want you to think that. An anxiety disorder is a hallmark feature of a child that has FASD. But if you disregard it, he only had it in 3rd grade, then you're less likely to believe the truth. And Nickolas suffered from depression, and that is also a hallmark of FASD. Nickolas also suffered from OCD, a hallmark feature of FASD. But Dr. Scott wants you to ignore the medical diagnosis from 3 providers that actually knew Nickolas, that saw Nickolas and provided him with treatment, and say he doesn't have it. Because if he has it, then he doesn't have FASD. And just because a kid can swim with floaties doesn't mean they can swim when you take them off. And that's what happened when Nick went to MSD. Dr. Scott tried to tell you that everybody wanted him to go there, that he was doing so well. But we know that that's not true because the ESE specialist did not want him at MSD. The LEA specialist did not want him at MSD. It was not the right placement for him. And when those people went to Denise Reed, the assistant principal at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, she was in charge of ESE, they were told to stay in their lane. He never should have left Cross Creek. That is the environment that he belongs in. And here's another almost terrifying thing. Dr. Ortiz, her progress note, psychiatrist from Cross Creek, wrote in her notes that because of Nickolas's fascination with the military and his fascination with guns, that junior ROTC was not recommended, not advised. And not only did Nickolas take the junior ROTC class, but he enrolled in marksmanship. And we know from Dr. Scott, the clip that you saw, that at MSD, in the marksmanship class, in the junior ROTC, is where he learned how to shoot a gun. Despite the psychiatrist saying he should not be involved in that. All of the evidence that you have heard and seen that is supported by the records. No, everybody told you that Linda never truly appreciated what was wrong with Nickolas. She loved Nickolas very much. And she loved Zachary very much. But if love could have fixed everything, then everything would have been fine. But the evidence has shown you that Linda consistently minimized, enabled, ignored, excused, defended, and ultimately lied to the very people that were trying to help Nickolas from what he needed the most. What Dr. Jones tells you is the most important thing, a proper diagnosis. And with a proper diagnosis of FASD, maybe Linda would have had the relief and the hope that Dr. Jones talked about that parents get when they finally understand what is wrong with their child. She would have realized she was not a bad parent and that Nickolas was not a bad kid, that he was a mentally ill, brain-damaged child. But Linda lived in the world that she had created in her 4,500 square foot house. It's a consistent theme throughout her life. And in that adoption report, if you choose to read it, there's a lot of information about Linda's life and where she grew up, how her mother abandoned her, a lot of the things that I told you in opening statement. And Linda's financial insecurity, the betrayal and abandonment that she felt from Roger, forced her to put locks on fridges, ration food from her children, kept the house thermostat at 80 degrees, and she would tell people that she didn't have any money to buy food for her children so people would bring groceries. And at the very same time, she had over 8 $500,000 in the bank. It defies logic. But Linda wasn't thinking logically. She was an overwhelmed, lonely mother of 2 very difficult children. And every provider, Dr. Kravitz, Dr. Negan, you have the records from Dr. Dejani, all told you that Linda was not compliant with recommendations for treatment. She was not compliant with medication. And she would try and save money by not giving Nickolas the medication that he so desperately needed. And Dr. Negan made a recommendation that Nickolas should go into a residential treatment place, a facility. And we know from Steve Sinkoff that she didn't want to do that because she would lose his Social Security benefits and she couldn't survive. That's part of the shame and the stigma that Dr. Jones tells us about. We have tried with every fiber of our being to bring you all of the information that you need in order to make the best appropriate decision from people that were actually involved in Nickolas's life. And ladies and gentlemen, you have to make a decision about whether or not another human being lives or dies. And I am sure that this is not the first difficult decision that you've had to make in your life. And when you have to make difficult decisions, I'm sure that you may talk to a friend, you may seek spiritual guidance, you may do some research, you may consult an expert. And when you have to make a life or death decision, do you want an expert that is a generalist, that practices a little bit of everything? Or do you want an expert that specializes in the area of FASD? Do you want a jack of all trades? Or do you want Dr. Jones, who is the leading expert in the world? He literally was the first person to diagnose somebody with FSA, fetal alcohol syndrome, in 1973. Do you want Dr. Connor, who is the #1 neuropsychologist who specializes in what? FASD. That's it. Or do you want to listen to to Dr. Scott and Dr. Denny, who have admitted to you that they are not experts in FASD? But what do? They come in here and they try and tell you that Dr. Connor's testing is flawed. But what does Dr. Connor tell you? Because he's an expert in FASD. That he has developed a very specific battery over his 30 years of experience. A battery that has been published and peer-reviewed. A battery of tests that is specifically designed to see if somebody has FASD or neurological impairments. And that's why his chart looks the way that it looks. Because those tests are designed specifically for that diagnosis. So, Dr. Denny, board certified, highly credentialed, wants you to look at all of the testing that isn't even related to FASD. So you decide who is more credible, who you want to rely on when you're making a life or death decision. Do you want to rely on the #1 experts in the country on FASD? Or do you want to rely on 2 experts that are not?
Okay, we have a number of jurors that need a break. Ladies and gentlemen, please do not discuss the case. Please leave your notepads behind, and we'll take a 15-minute recess so that you all can use the restroom. Thank you. All right, the jurors have been excused. A number of them needed a break. So we're going to take a 15-minute recess. Someone was leaning down, so I wasn't sure. I didn't see you. Okay, everyone else may be seated. To bench whenever you're ready, you may continue.
Thank you. I know that you guys are getting tired, so I'm going to try and wrap things up. Please understand how important this is, and I feel like I want and need to tell you everything. One of the things that Dr. Denny and Dr. Scott, two experts working for the state of Florida, paid over $400,000 to come in here and tell you that Nickolas Cruz wasn't mentally ill. This is the DSM-5-TR. All the experts have talked about it. It is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, is in this book for a reason. Because they are mental illnesses. And Dr. Denny wants you to think that just because it's in the Bible for mental health, that it's not a mental health disorder. And one of the benefits of working with so many wonderful people is they remind me when I'm wrong. So I want to clear something up because I misspoke, and I never want to mislead you. But what Paul Gold told you when he testified is that as a result of this event, he vowed to save 17 people's lives so that he could try and help the horror of what happened. And that's when he donated to the Underground Railroad, which has saved hundreds of women from being sex trafficked. So I did not mean to mislead you, and I thank my team for correcting me. There's been a lot of conversations about IOM, CDC, Canadian guidelines, domains. It's all really confusing, and I understand that. But remember what Dr. Denny told you, that real world actions trump any testing. This is Nickolas Cruz's real world actions from before he was born. Remember that when you make your decision about whether he should live or die. And Dr. Denny wants you to believe that Dr. Connor twisted the diagnosis. So let's talk about very briefly the CDC guidelines and what they actually require. A deficit with one standard deviation. Not 1.5, not 2 standard deviations. The CDC guidelines require 1 standard deviation for a deficit, and that is what Dr. Connor used. And the CDC guidelines also said, and I can't even tell you how many times Mr. Secor said this to Dr. Denny, and he wouldn't agree with him, but he doesn't have to, because the CDC guidelines are was 2 federal judges in 2 other cases wrote opinions that Dr. Denny does not follow guidelines in those 2 cases, and they found him to be less than credible. Take that into consideration when you weigh and evaluate his testimony. The state's doctors and the state want you to believe that Nickolas can control his behavior, and because he can control his behavior, he only has a personality disorder. They gave you consistently 4 examples, maybe 5, in his 24 years of life that he has successfully been able to control his behavior. When he was in Coral Springs Elementary, when they said, we're going to call the school resource officer, he controlled himself. Agreed. When he was at Westglades Middle School, when the vice principal came into the classroom, Nickolas controlled himself. I agree. When he was with Dr. Denny and when he was with Dr. Scott, he controlled himself. Maybe I missed one. Please rely on your memory about his level of control. And how beneficial was all of that stuff that Nickolas told Dr. Denny and Dr. Scott? What was the secondary gain by telling him all of the horrible things that he did to animals? That he thought of people? Baking? I don't think so. It's another interesting thing that Dr. Denny said when Mr. Secor was talking to him. He was talking about cognitive abilities and brain development. And what Dr. Denny said is, we know that brain development of a normal person goes into the early 20s. And we know that Nickolas isn't normal. But a normal brain's development goes into their 20s. So you can consider that a mitigation. We are not here to suggest that you don't punish Nickolas Cruz. We're asking you to take into consideration his damage when you make that decision. And as you consider and weigh mitigation, and I told you over and over again that mitigation can be anything, and it's reasons for life. And it can mean different things to different people. And you can give it as much weight as you want a particular circumstance, and you can disregard it, because it's an individualized moral decision. But as you listened to the testimony over the last couple months, were there things about Nickolas's life that you wished hadn't happened? Are there things about Nickolas's life that didn't happen that you wished had? Are there things that he didn't get that you wish he would have gotten? Was he missing people in his life that you wished he hadn't missed? I suspect you would answer yes to each of those questions. And every time you do, that's mitigation. That's a reason for life. And one of the most important people in Nickolas's life, his external brain that Dr. Lyons talked about, Linda Cruz, died on November 1st. And sure, he may have been searching and doing planning and wanting to be a mass shooter. He told everybody, remember, the state told you that. I wish people would have listened. I wish people would have done something. But he didn't do it until after he lost the most important person in his life, his mother. The one thing that kept him together. There is no punishment that you could ever give Nickolas Cruz that would ever make him suffer as much as those people have and as much as they will continue to suffer every single day. And sentencing Nickolas to death will not change that. It will not bring back those 17 people. Sentencing Nickolas to death will literally serve no purpose at all other than vengeance. And you have heard emotional, heartbreaking, gut-wrenching testimony from the loved ones of the people that Nickolas murdered. But we talked to each and every one of you about that. They came in here, those families, to tell you how unique their loved ones were and the impact that their loss has on this community. And they had every right to do that. But you promised and you took an oath that as difficult as it will be, you will not take that into consideration when you do your weighing and your deliberation. Victim impact statements are not aggravators. You cannot consider it. The only aggravation that you can consider is the 7 things that Mr. Sachs talked about, if you believe that they were proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And even if you believe that all 7 aggravators were proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt, every one, they're as heavy and as weighted as an aggravator could possibly be, you can still vote for life because you are never required to vote for death. The law is satisfied with the life verdict. You have to agree on all of the aggravation because aggravators are facts. You can agree on that. You do not have to agree on mitigation because mitigation is different to different people. And it can come from anything in Nickolas's life, his background, how he behaved in this. Oh, that was the other control thing, right? He can control his behavior in the courtroom. But I think it was Mr. Secor that reminded Dr. Denny that he's medicated and he's under psychiatric care. He's being treated by the jail psychologist. He didn't want you to know that, right? But you can take anything into consideration for mitigation. Anything you heard here, anything you saw, or anything that you believe in your heart and your soul. And you don't have to defend it, and you don't have to explain it. And the law recognizes and authorizes you to give a sentence based on mercy alone. And sometimes the people that deserve the least amount of compassion and grace and remorse are the ones that should get it. It is important to remember that what Nickolas may do in the future cannot be a reason for death. So those letters that they showed you, the school shooter stuff, those pictures that show his visual spatial, you can't take that into consideration. It's not an aggravator. But what you can take into consideration is what positive things he can do in the future. We always know that Nickolas suffered and continues to suffer with an internal struggle. That's why he's searching for response times to mass shootings. And in the same time, the same hour, why don't I have any feelings? Homicide hotline. How do I get help? It's this conflict inside of him. So that's why he can talk to Scarlett Lewis, one of the most amazing people I have ever met in my life. A pure example of love and grace and compassion and mercy. Her son was murdered by a school shooter, and she has dedicated her life to talking to those people so that she can provide emotional and social learning to young children. So that it never gets to the point where the only solution is an AR-15. Nickolas is the only surviving school shooter that has gone to trial.
Objection, not in evidence.
Sustained.
Look at what we have already learned. FASD, mental illness, what happens when people don't do their job, when the school district doesn't do evaluations. What
Objection,
else?
Your Honor. Third party.
Sustained.
What else could we learn by keeping Nickolas Cruz alive? We could use him to learn, to educate others.
Objection, not in evidence.
It's
Sustained.
mitigation.
Sustained.
Individuals that are not mentally ill do not take their hemorrhoid blood and write 666 on the cell, on the wall of their cell. Think about that. He's not mentally ill. He doesn't have a neurodevelopmental disorder. A vote for death is a vote that will execute every part of his body, even the parts that he can contribute to the society. There are people that love him. Scarlett Lewis loves him. Trish Devaney loves him. Paul Gold loves him. His brother loves him. Pastor Black loves him. He means something to people.
Sustained. If there are things that were not brought forth in evidence, Ms. McNeil, you cannot talk about them.
Everyone agrees that even if you don't like those individuals that are voting for life, that you would respect their verdict. And when that person makes a decision that life is the appropriate penalty, we're done. You can ring the buzzer. This is a personal moral decision, like the decision you make when you decide to marry someone or not get married. What religion you want to practice, if you choose to practice a religion. Do I have children? Where do I send my children to school? It's that personal. So look into your heart, look into your soul. The right thing here, not the popular thing, is a life sentence. And if you have to ask yourself, how do I know if I'm making the right decision? If you follow the law, you're making the right decision. And I promise you that one day, I don't know when, but one day, I promise you, you will ask yourself, did I make the right decision? You will never regret voting for life. You can show Nickolas Cruz all the things that he did not show those 17 victims. You can show him the things that he least deserves. Compassion, grace, and mercy. Grace is not a limited resource. Compassion is not a limited resource. Mercy is not a limited resource. Sentencing Nickolas Cruz to life is the right thing to do. So I now put in your hands his life. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to, well, you all are going to get to leave a bit early today. I'm going to pass out